Hi, everybody. This is the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, or 1877 to 1917, and I want to talk today about the U.S. in Asia. When we last spoke, we talked about the U.S. and its involvement in the Cuban Revolution and the way in which the Spanish-American War ultimately makes Cuba a kind of possession of the United States, dependency of the United States. And today I want to talk about the Philippines and, but more generally, put this in the context of Asia and the U.S. and the Pacific. If you would send me an emoji to make sure that you're there so that I know that you're alive, that would be great. Awesome. Hello. Hope all is well. I hope you guys had a good weekend. All right. Ghosts, right. I hope you guys got lots of, you guys are too old to get candy, I suppose. There were a lot of people in their 20s who were getting candy in in our neighborhood. We ran out of candy. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay, today is complicated, and we're actually going to have to go back a ways, even to before this period, to really get a sense of why the U.S. in Asia is an issue, why the U.S. in the Pacific is an issue. And even though it says 1852 to 1917, which is sort of before our period, I'm actually going to go back a little bit to empire generally, because people say that the United States becomes an empire in this period, and I think that there's something to that. Other people say that the U.S. has been an empire really from the very beginning. I don't think it is in the sort of traditional sense of empire. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. So the big takeaway today is that there were empires in Asia and the Middle East that are important to understand. So we shouldn't be just thinking about Europe when we're thinking about empires. And the U.S. was more involved in trying to profit by and influence Asia than we might think, going all the way back to the 1830s and 40s. And the U.S. intervention attempts to build up a certain kind of empire in Japan, alongside France and Germany, that ends up ultimately hurting the United States in the very long term with World War II. By the time of the U.S. military actions in the Philippines, the U.S. looks much more like an empire than previously. But to do that, let's talk a little bit about what empires are. All right, so just to give you a sense of this, to understand what's happening in the Pacific, we need to step back a bit. So before the European invasion, before 1492, we have a world of empires. And before 1815, sorry, I'm not trying to do all of this, but I want to just remind you. Before 1815, Britain, France, and Spain and the Netherlands were taking slaves in Africa, shipping them to the New World, and then producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which was then being sent back to Europe. After the American Revolution and the defeat of Napoleon in France, Britain creates a new way of deriving wealth from its control of sea lanes around the world. So this is Britain in 1815. 1815 to 1914 has been called the period of Pax Britannica, or sort of peace under the British. And it's in this period that we see some really important changes in the way empires work. Britain, for example, abolishes slavery in 1833 and then tries to block other empires from trading in slaves. The British Empire's most important and most valuable space is over here in, I'll move this over, in basically what has previously been the Mughal Empire, that peach area here. And Britain doesn't control the whole area, but it does control the sort of southern and eastern edges of the Mughal Empire by 1815. And this is more or less taking apart, Britain is more or less taking apart and raiding for its internal and external trade, this region. Indian woven goods and prints, best in the world in 1815, are being copied, mechanized, and then in Britain, and then re-exported back to India and the rest of the world. Britain becomes a world empire in part by exporting cheap clothing. One of Britain's biggest imports is tea, much of it coming from Ceylon. The wealthiest Britons are the people who are coming back from India, having worked in the East India Company, having made their fortunes in India. Britain's policy, I'd suggest, without ever being explicitly stated, is to take apart the empires that control trade lanes, including the Ottoman Empire. Now, let me go back here for a second and say, if you look at the empire in 1815, Britain is all about islands, not really about controlling regions. It's all about controlling areas that are the pinch points of international trade. So, for example, Gibraltar here, between Europe and Africa, Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean, Gambia and Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, which is any trade between the east and the west that goes via Africa has to pass by Gambia and Sierra Leone, so it's important for Britain to have small colonies there. A Cape Colony in South Africa, which was now South Africa, around the Great Horn, again, not to control territory so much as to sort of control the sea lanes, to be sure that Britain controls this long-distance trade. Britain has a small army, a tiny army, and a massive navy, and that's sort of how the British Empire operates. Its policy then in the 1830s is to sort of take apart the empires that exist in the Ottoman Empire, back up here, which is in the Middle East, and the Qing Empire, which is over here, and most of what we would call China, to tear apart these empires slowly from within. The way they do this is, it's not originally their intention. Originally their intention is to profit from control of India. The trouble is that India doesn't provide a whole lot of exports, and it doesn't import a whole lot. And so in trying to sort of resolve this problem, the British settle on the opium trade. They figure that it's possible to to grow opium in high quantities, to plant poppy seeds in India, particularly Western India, ship it short overland to China, and then sell it or sell it to smugglers in China, so that they can generate exchange, and then in that exchange bring back tea, silk, and porcelain. So basically, China is a sort of a way station, or India is a sort of way station for the plucking out of the sort of wealth of China, particularly tea. The U.S. is importing, Britain is importing a tremendous amount of tea. As Britain expands into India, it has a series of costly wars, and the way to solve this is to produce super high quality opium, smuggle it into China, and in exchange China will send back tea, silk, and porcelain. Now, China, as you can imagine, is not so keen about this, the prospects here. China tries to block the Cohong merchants control trade. They try to block this trade, and at one point, basically, the sort of governor general, the Chinese version of the governor general in Canton, destroys a massive quantity of British opium. And it had previously only allowed merchants into a few ports. Britain fights back by demanding pay for all of the opium that was destroyed. They use the traditional British strategy of a large navy and a small army. And in the Opium Wars, in 1839 to 1842, is the first set of Opium Wars. Basically what they do is bombard cities, take them over, loot, and pillage. And basically this is because they demand payback for all the illegal opium that was destroyed by the Chinese. And it's basically to open up the Chinese market to Great Britain. The U.S. benefits from this so-called opening of China. So it's 1839 to 1842 is a series of tremendously successful attacks. Right. They send steam-powered ironclads against the junks. There are some. There's not really much of a. It's a very one-sided battle in this conflict. But some of the biggest fortunes in the United States come about as a result of the Opium Wars, because the U.S. benefits from the so-called opening of China. So China, what China does is gives up Hong Kong, a tiny little island, just like Britain wants, as a trading point, and it basically says if the British want to import opium, they can. We can't stop them. The U.S., though, has most favored nation status with Great Britain, and that means that the U.S. gets the same advantages as Britain does in the China trade. Involved in the U.S. opium trade are some of the people who developed the major fortunes in the United States before the Gilded Age. This is William Henry Aspinwall on the top, John Jacob Astor down here, where Astor Place, George Peabody there in the middle, who creates the bank which would ultimately become J.P. Morgan, Morgan Stanley. John Murray Forbes up in the upper right there, which is where Forbes magazine comes, another one of the great fortunes of the 19th century, and Junius Morgan there on the lower right. All of them are smuggling opium into China, all of them making a tremendous fortune, then bringing tea and other porcelain and other things back to the United States. In the aftermath of this, we see the Taiping Rebellion. And if you look back here, this is where the ports are being attacked in the Qing Empire, right? So this sort of southeastern edge. And this is also where the Taiping Rebellion starts. So one of the things that Britain and the U.S. are allowed to do in this period is to send missionaries over, and these missionaries are much against the wishes of the Chinese emperor. And these missionaries also kind of open China. And there's a growing influence of European ideas, or a kind of version of European ideas. Hong Xiuquan, born in 1813, awakes from a coma in 1837 and says that he's the younger brother of Jesus, and he will clean the Manchu rulers out of China. He says this shortly after the British have invaded. And he says he's going to create a heavenly kingdom of great peace, the Taiping Tianguo. And he creates a European-style militia, drafting lots and lots of soldiers to his side. His plan is to create collective ownership of the land. And you can see on the left and the right, this is a sketch of the Taiping hairstyle and the imperial hairstyle. And that's one of the ways in which you could distinguish these Taiping rebels. And Hong Xiuquan is very successful at mobilizing what are called the Hakka in China. These are people who had kind of come down from northern China to eastern China in the 12th century. They're still called Hakka, or visitors. And these are mostly day laborers, and many of them get sort of moved by this rebellion. The plan is to create collective ownership of the land. And so this rebellion sweeps across China from 1850 to 1864. And it creates the death toll. The estimate of the death toll is shocking. This is the highest death toll of any war. The final estimate is roughly 200 million people dead from war and from starvation, as the Taiping rebels started try to take over this region in southeastern China, and even to go all the way up to Canton. They're somewhat successful, but they ultimately fail. After the British success in the Opium Wars, Americans involved in the China trade, this is Forbes and Aspinwall and people like that, persuade Commodore Perry to visit Japan and force Japan to open its borders to engage in trade, just with a threat of the foreign fleet. And so Commodore Perry's Black Fleet is sent out to Japan, goes into the harbor of Edo, which is now Tokyo, and basically threatens Japan and demands that it open its ports in the same way that China had opened its ports in the Opium Wars. Now, what's different about Japan and China in the eyes of Europeans and Americans is the Americans viewed China as a barbaric society, back to the old Lewis Henry Morgan classification. But they viewed Japan as a feudal society, so somewhat more advanced than China. Let's just refresh our memories about where we are. This is Japan over here, and this is China here, right? Japan over here, Korea there, and then China down there. So, Japan, by comparison, was imagined as a romantic world that was stuck in feudalism for too long, with samurai and swords and serfs. And so there's a fascination, American fascination, European fascination with the samurai. They see it as basically themselves, maybe 800 years earlier or something like that. So rather than seeing it as a barbaric society, they see it as a kind of feudal society that's sort of stuck in the feudal ages and needs to be unstuck. So the Black Fleet is successful in what we would now call soft power. It basically threatens but does not actually invade or bombard Edo, but it forces Japan to open itself up. There are conflicts that emerge in Japan just like they had in China immediately afterwards. And a conflict between what's called the Boshin War, Boshin War inside China in 1868 and 1869, with the emperor against the nobles and the samurai who resent this increasing European influence. Now, the Boshin War was not as nearly as dramatic and tragic as the Taiping Rebellion. There were only 3,500 people killed probably in this conflict. And it's ultimately resolved with the Meiji Restoration, where which is much more acceptable to Europe and the United States. Yeah, it's the end of the shogunate, basically. Is which brings the Meiji Dynasty to power, and they're going to use American technologies, European armies, and a combination of British and American navies. Now, the U.S. response after, so Japan is seen by France, Germany, and the United States as being a proving ground for a new kind of Asian dynasty. They don't like the British involvement in China. They feel that Britain has a stranglehold in China, right, because of the Opium Wars. They are trading with opium and things like that, but they feel like the British have got the upper hand and that it's going to lead to chaos and tragedy in China. And so they want to kind of create a different sort of Asian empire. And so France, Germany, and the US contribute a lot to try to build up this Japanese empire to counterbalance the Britain's growing power inside China. So from 1868 to 1870, there are French military advisors, for example, that are brought to Japan to create a modern Japanese military that looks like the French. And then in 1871, after Germany defeats France in the Russo-Japanese War, kind of the story behind The Last Samurai. In the Russo-Japanese War, Germany defeats France, and Japan turns around and says, well, we want the German soldiers, not the French soldiers. And so the French leave, and they bring in German officers, and they create a kind of modern militia. So the Taiping rebels were the first kind of militia in Asia, and this is the second kind of militia in Asia, where there's a sort of drawing on drawing on Asian peasants, pulling them into the army, educating them in the way that 19th century American and European armies are educated, teaching them to use modern revolvers and pistols and things like that, and also work on major, large destroyers and other ships like that. This is the Japanese army that suppressed the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. And so there's still lots of chaos, and that's another last shogun, if you will. There are rebellions at various points in Japan against this sort of foreign influence. It's a good point. I mean, basically, Jacob Hall's question is, why do they get British ships? And the answer to that is that basically everyone recognized that in steam power, Britain was ahead, even of France and Germany. So while France, Germany, and the U.S. are very much see Japan as a sort of counter to Britain. Japan recognizes that if it's going to get the best ships in the world, it's going to have to get British ships, and so in fact it does get British ships. So there are some others, but British ships are the most important ones. Okay. The U.S. response after the Taiping Rebellion and the Meiji Restoration is to sell large quantities of flour and some wheat in Asia, particularly in Chinese and Japanese ports. Yeah, maybe you could argue that the Japanese played the Europeans by pushing one F against the other, getting them. But that it was really the hope of these European powers that there would be some sort of counterbalance to the British Empire. It's eating up of the Qing Empire. Basically, what Britain is doing is creating something called the Chinese Maritime Trade Association, which is controlling the internal trade in China, and it's basically carving up these pieces of China. And yeah, it's a good. You could say that Japan sort of gets one over on them. Okay. But so the U.S. is sending flour and wheat largely to Japan, just as it's sending it to Europe, right? So remember that America is sending all this wheat across the Atlantic. It's also sending all this wheat across the Pacific to China and Japan. And there is much resistance to to American agricultural imports now has to do with the fact that the U.S. is importing all this flour, sending all this flour and wheat to Europe in this early period when basically their tariff walls are forcefully brought down by the United States and by Great Britain. Okay, now just to kind of give you a sense, I'm sorry for the this is so the Christian missionaries that emerge in the United States. That emerge in Japan that are really behind this educational effort. And the U.S. is really providing much of the support for the creation of educational institutions in Japan in this period. Hokkaido University, Kyoto University are all have lots of American missionaries and others who are providing the staff for these universities, sort of train them in these new European and American style technologies. And this is a passion play, Japanese version of a passion play, which is that's supposed to be Christ on the cross there. And a lot of these schools that are established in Japan are missionary schools. And a lot of missionary universities, Baptist and Methodist universities, send over missionaries who establish schools in these regions. Okay, there is a conflict then between China and Japan that a couple of you alluded to last time. Yes, exactly. So that's right. So when the what's called the Gentleman's Agreement emerges in 1907. The Gentleman's Agreement between between the United States and Japan, that Japan will no longer allow people to leave. The U.S. will no longer accept Japanese, is because they viewed Japan as being much more civilized than China. So the Japanese Navy fights China over the control of Korea and this peninsula called the Liaodong Peninsula on the Yellow Sea. And it's basically just like the Opium Wars, a total sweep. Japan just totally sweeps through China with relatively little pushback, and it's tremendously successful. And as you can see, there are all these waterborne invasions, amphibious landings, and things like that by the Japanese, and they can sort of place troops anywhere because they have these destroyers and other ships. They establish then a pro-Japanese leader in Korea, so it's a sort of informal empire in Japan, and they also control the Liaodong Peninsula. That's the settlement that the Japanese get from the Chinese. And this is a Japanese print from the period right after the Sino-Japanese War, and it gives you a sense of the Japanese sense themselves as being kind of European style, modern folks, and the Chinese being kind of backward, mired in barbarity and savagism, and relying on Lewis Henry Morgan's idea that there's a sort of backward society in China and a progressive society in Japan. In 1895, though, right after the war, France, Germany, and Russia, and this is where they get Japan back for the bamboozling. France, Germany, and Russia meet with Japan, and they tell them to renounce the claims on the Liaodong Peninsula. They say, you can control Korea by placing a sort of puppet there, but you can't control the Liaodong Peninsula. You have to give it back to China. That's what Russia, Japan, and China do. Russia is keen on potentially moving down into this region. France and Germany don't want decide that Japan should not be that powerful that it controls all of the Yellow Sea, or the 2/3 of the Yellow Sea by controlling the Liaodong Peninsula. And it's at this point that Russia gets involved, and Russia creates something called the Trans-Siberian Railway, and it spreads from it started in the 1880s, but in the 1890s, after the settlement in 1895, it runs its own train line all the way down to Port Arthur and claims, under China's sort of this region, claiming the whole Liaodong Peninsula. It's also going to go to Vladivostok. But the real attraction here for Russia is to compete with the United States, because Russia does not have a warm, deep water port for the export of its grain that is on the ocean. It has Odessa, which is on the Black Sea, and it has Archangel and a couple of places in the north, but it doesn't really have a continuously warm water port on the ocean, and Liaodong Peninsula is going to be that. Siberia is going to produce all sorts of grain, according to Russia, and it's going to come out here in in the Yellow Sea, and is going to make Russia a great imperial power. Does that make sense? So basically the triple intervention in 1895 forces Japan to give up the region that it grabbed from China, and then Russia, sort of on its own, makes a separate agreement to establish this port. This is going to be important when we try to understand World War I later. Basically another empire, the Russian Empire, all the way at the top, is trying to steal a march on Japan. Okay, so that's a little bit of background now, so that we can talk about the Philippines, because we need to talk about the Philippines. Let's go to where the Philippines is in this context. So the Philippine Islands are down here, Japan is up here, and China is over here. And I'm going to spend some time looking at this map in a minute. But that's so the Philippines is part of the Spanish Empire. The U.S., after the Spanish-American War, claims not just Cuba, but also the Philippines. After the treaty, after the Spanish-American War is concluded, Congress finishes the work that it outlined of establishing dreaming of a canal in Central America, and providing connections all the way to China, a coaling station in Hawaii, a coaling station in the Philippines, giving you access to the Chinese market. And that's what the United States, some of the sort of expansionist Republicans and expansionist Democrats want. One little piece, though, doesn't work. McKinley pledges that the U.S. will, quote, educate the Filipinos and to uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And they do not view the Philippines as being anything like Japan. They view the Philippines as being backward and barbaric, in some ways even worse than China. And they said they're going to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, forgetting, in fact, that the Filipinos are Christians. They're all Catholics. So it's not like they've never been exposed to Christianity before. The Filipinos read, and Emilio Aguinaldo in particular reads the Treaty of Paris between the U.S. and Spain, in which the Philippines were not even invited to this meeting, and discover that the U.S. is going to annex their country, in much the way that Russia Japan is annexing Korea, or Russia is annexing parts of Asia, Britain is annexing parts of Africa. The former rebels in the Philippines protest and attack the base in Manila. American military officers, because they believe that the Filipinos are not very civilized, predict a short battle. American troops, many veterans of the Indian Wars of the 1880s, provoke the conflict. One reported later that he was right? There are a lot of treaties of Paris. This is the 1898 Treaty of Paris. The American military officers, where are we? Yeah, one soldier reported that he was just itching to get at the and then N word. He describes the Filipinos as the N word. American soldiers awaiting action insulted and physically abused civilians. They raped Filipino women and whipped up resentment. The result is a modern guerrilla war. This is Aguinaldo and his advisors in 1890s. Every male Filipino who was over 10 was to be regarded as a potential enemy who could be shot for any reason. U.S. troops attacked civilians. They destroyed food, housing, and water supplies. In fact, they used many of the same techniques that Weyler did in Cuba. Remember, Weyler was this sort of brutal Spanish general who, as governor general of Cuba, cuts off people's water supplies, cuts them off from their homes, tries to relocate them and things like that. The United States does, it intervenes in this war, saying that Weyler is, a tyrant and that he's doing these terrible things and he's killing lots of people. But disturbingly, the United States does almost exactly the same thing in the Philippines. It creates these reconcentration camps and yes, they're using many of the same techniques. A. Barnes of the 3rd Regiment described the slaughter of 1,000 men, women, and children in the Philippines to retaliate for one American death, and wrote home that, quote, "I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger." Troops were ordered to take no prisoners, and so forced Filipino civilians to dig their own graves, and then bragged about killing the wounded. The ratio of the dead to wounded in the Civil War was 1 to 5, so 1 person dead for every 5 persons wounded. The ratio in the Philippines was 15 to 1, 15 dead for every 1 person wounded. So basically, they accept no wounded people, they killed wounded people, and killed people who surrendered. The fighting stopped in 1902, so it's lasted 4 years, with 4,000 Americans killed and 20,000 Filipinos killed in combat, and 250,000 dead from collateral injury, starvation, and disease. The Philippines remained a U.S. territory until after World War II. In fact, in my lifetime, it's switched over from a U.S. territory to it's an independent country. So what began, going all the way back to last class when we talked about sugar, it's what began as sugar leads to savagery, but in an odd way. The Cubans were viewed as barbarians that could be lifted up. The Filipinos, though, were viewed as beneath barbarism in the Lewis Henry Morgan framework. They're viewed as savages that could not be educated to U.S. institutions. They needed love. The Japanese, on the other hand, were viewed as feudal and therefore higher up. And so there's this framework for understanding foreign peoples. This Morgan framework is very much on people's minds. Race is not really exactly the issue. It's this issue of how civilized the society is. When the Filipinos reject American institutions, when they say that they want their own government, the Americans turn to Lewis Henry Morgan and say the only thing they will understand is force, because they are savages, not even barbarians. After being forced to accept our rule, they will begin to accept democracy. In the end, this is an American outpost, in Luzon. It does. It is very much like Vietnam, and this is one of the these are British American troops sort of holding captured Filipinos here. Okay, I'm going to go back to Perry in a minute. In the end, though, Japanese power with the U.S., French, and German assistance, and so this is what happens in the Philippines, this kind of ugly path, and it just does suggest that the U.S. is becoming a kind of brutal empire in just the way that it had really protested against Europeans doing in the same way. Right, and so what we see then is Japan growing increasingly disturbed by all these other empires and seeing itself as an empire as well. So, again, the Japanese military power with the U.S., French, and German assistance They sign unequal treaties with the U.S. and France and Germany. The hope was that they would counterbalance British power in China. But Japan also becomes resentful of attempts to rein in its power, like in 1895. In World War I, it's going to side with France, US, and Russia against Germany, but in World War II, it will side with Germany against the United States. And so this is the sort of longer Asian story that the kind of capture of the Philippines represents. Japan had viewed the United States as being not imperial by not taking this land. But if you look at this, so what's going on in this image is this is a Japanese image, and what's going on in this image? What's the takeaway from this image? Oh, sorry, it's a little bit too big, isn't it? Let's look at the top here. How does Japan view the rest of the world in this image? Empire of the Sun is holding on for dear life, right? It's right on the edge here. They're surrounded by these foreigners who are descending on a China that's collapsing, right? So we've got the Russian bear up here with the imperial signet on the top. That's the symbol of the Russians is that double-headed eagle, borrowed in fact from the which empire is it borrowed from? It's borrowed from the empire that preceded the Ottoman Empire. It's the Empire of New Rome in Constantinople. Russia is a major threat to them. You see the sort of what's up here is Byzantines, Holy Roman Empire. Thank you. I don't know why my brain isn't working today. I've been reading, yes, the Eastern Empire also, yes. So that's what Russia sees itself as the heir to the Eastern Empire, and that they're gonna occupy these regions come hell or high water. So this here is opium, right? That's being smuggled in by these sort of warlords who are allied with the British, these smugglers. And these warlords are going to be have increasing power in China, and so this is a sort of Chinese man sort of looking on as this opium is being smuggled in. This is China, the collapsed, basically filled with opium eaters, incapable of really defending itself. This is the center of China's kind of food producing region, and here is the British bulldog, right? The American eagle, the frog to represent France. All of them are surrounding. Yes, John Bull and I will watch the bear. Oh, good. That's good. Great point. Goes back to the Japanese Navy's assistance from Great Britain. Right, that the bear is the threatened Russia and John Bull. That's excellent. I didn't know that was where that expression came from. Okay, so this is what will happen with China, with Japan over time as it becomes an empire, very much in the kind of model of the European empires. So when we talk about empires, it's important to kind of recognize what we mean. If we're talking about modern empires, and Japan is looking more and more like a modern empire, relying on a navy. Relying on its naval power to dominate other regions around it. That's how it dominates Korea, and ultimately, Japan will get back that Liaodong Peninsula from Russia. All right, so I'm reminded here of O.H. Perry, not Matthew, who commanded naval forces in Lake Erie in 1812, and he has this expression: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." That was in the War of 1812, the defeat of the British on Lake Erie in 1812. There weren't a whole lot of American victories in War of 1812, so the United States sort of remembers that phrase, and it's Walt Kelly later on in the 1950s that reflects on the U.S. Sorry, in the 60s and 70s, reflecting on the U.S. in Korea and in Japan later, but largely the U.S. influence in Asia says we have met the enemy, and he is us. Okay, so to conclude, there were empires in Asia and the Middle East. They're important to understand. The U.S. is, and so we shouldn't, become, when we talk about empires, we shouldn't just think about Britain. We shouldn't just think about France. There is a Qing Empire. There is an Ottoman Empire. There are these other Asian empires that are slowly being kind of gobbled up by Britain between 1815 and 1914, and the so-called Pax Britannica, that's sort of weakening them partly through trade, partly through opium and smuggling and things like that. The U.S. is more involved in trying to profit by and influence Asia than we might think. Some of the largest fortunes in the United States are built up with the opium trade with China. And the U.S. intervention tries to build up a certain kind of empire, ultimately that ends up in Japan, that ultimately ends up hurting the United States much later in the 1940s and in 1941. By the time of the U.S. military actions in the Philippines, though, we'd have to agree with Kelly, with Pogo, that the U.S. military actions make the U.S. look much more like the sort of uglier empires that we had previously. Sorry, that was a rush through roughly 100 years of history. Are there questions about how we get here and what are the conclusions? This image. No questions? All right. So it's a short day today. Thanks so much. I thought this was going to take 2 hours. This takeaway. So when we talk about imperialism in this period, it's helpful to think about this sort of military domination by gunboats and the so-called gunboat diplomacy. And the best early example of this is the British attacks on the Qing Empire. And the results of these things is not just the devastation that takes place in the Opium Wars, but also the social upheaval that often follows, like the Taiping Rebellion in China. In the U.S., in Japan, likewise, the result of Commodore Perry's Black Fleet, which is a sort of soft power, it's a sort of threat. We will fire on you if you don't let us trade with you. Ultimately does lead to social conflict and chaos in those regions, but ultimately the Meiji Restoration. Oh, yeah. Well, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, this is the lead up to World War One. Russia is expanding, basically creating its empire, and is expanding in the 1880s all the way across Siberia, and it's going to build this port at Port Arthur. In 1904 and 1905, it's going to be taken from them by Japan. Japan is going to destroy the Russian fleet in 1904 and 1905 in what's called the Russo-Japanese War, which overturns many of the sort of European ideas that there are Europeans who are more civilized and Asians who are less so. Yes, it wasn't really an enemy. The assumption was that the Japanese were basically potential allies who could kind of hold back, that could organize and reshape Asia, that a collapsing China was maybe not, what may be dangerous, and maybe a new kind of empire that's formed with Japan at the heart might be more sensible. That's I think largely the issue. For the Japanese, it's interesting because there was a lot of sense that the technologies, these marvels of the technology, were important. But in Japan and China, there was this sort of thought, and the missionaries didn't disabuse them of this, that that sort of Christianity was what gave you these modern things. The Japanese picture. It may be. So yeah, I'll talk. It's fascinating what sort of why Russia fails in 1904 and 1905. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the buildup of World War One. Actually, we've got a couple more minutes. Let me just briefly go through what happens here. So 1895, they have to give up the Liaodong Peninsula, and Russia then rushes in, and France and Germany and the U.S. and Great Britain are quite disturbed by this sort of rapid construction of this railroad here to Port Arthur, and the Russian fleet is and the militia organization of Japan, I think, is probably the most important thing for understanding why Japan succeeds, why its navy succeeds in particular, because this idea that you don't treat your peasants as basically cannon fodder, but that peasants should be educated. They should learn to shoot straight. They should learn to drill. They should learn to operate heavy machinery and operate these weapons of war on battleships and elsewhere is very much the sort of German model of the way you prosecute a war, going all the way back to Frederick the Great. But 1815 forward is that German model of educated citizenry that's going to fight your wars for you because they're going to be able to use these new technologies that others can't. That's that becomes the Japanese model, and so the Japanese military is just fantastically organized. The ships, ship per ship, in the what becomes the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, you would have predicted, in fact, that Russia would win. But they aim so badly because you still have this old Russian imperial framework where you have all these old Russian elites that have more or less bought their positions in the Russian Navy, and they are just can't be successful at defeating the Japanese. The Japanese fire so much more precisely because everybody is trained, everybody knows the drill, they understand what's going to happen when they're going to fight. Many of the Russian peasants who are really just off the farm and kind of landed in the British Navy being yelled at by Russian imperial officers just despise, in many cases, the people that are over them. And with a battleship and a destroyer and these newer kinds of ships, you really do need a highly disciplined, highly well-trained, extremely well-trained sailors to make this all work. And even though Russia had really some fantastic ships, they were easily defeated by the more mobile and better organized Japanese troops. As well, Japanese troops did better drilling. It's a much more of a kind of face-to-face conflict. There were kind of roughly equal casualties on both the Japanese and the Russian side on land, but it's the Japanese capacity at sea is really what allows them to win. Okay, thanks so much. There we go. Wooden ships and iron men, right? So we'll talk about we'll talk a little bit about Gay New York, and we'll talk about the coming of World War One. But just to kind of, and I apologize for stepping all the way back to AP US and all the way back to AP World, but I just wanted to clarify a little bit about empire. When we talk about empire in Immerwahr's book later on, we'll talk about what his idea of empire is. And what is an American empire? Is the United States an empire in the sort of old-fashioned sense? Might be an excellent question for the final exam. Thanks so much. Talk to you guys soon. Sign off, everybody. Send me an emoji to know that you're leaving. Okay. Thanks, everybody. All right. See you guys on Wednesday. Thanks.